Marty is the agent of chaos. He is the enemy of fate and destiny. Life is precious and important, and Marty wants to preserve that. And I think that's strong, that's powerful, that's meaningful in a sense that not a lot of people talk about this film. It is specifically about spitting in the face of destiny and fate and predestination.
Hello, and welcome to My Favorite Movie Is, a podcast all about why we love our favorite movies. I'm your host, Larry Freed, and for today's inaugural episode, we're talking to YouTube video essayist and Game Rant features writer Max Marriner all about his favorite movie, Back to the Future.
It's about, it's a crowd pleaser that wears its heart on its sleeve, and it's not subtle in its delivery. Like, this is what's happening. These are the emotions that are on display. These are the emotions that we want to convey to you. And we pick it up. We pick it up because the film earns it.
We talk about the film's airtight first act, its commentary on destiny and fate, and how a film that is such a product of its time remains absolutely timeless. I mean, I honestly couldn't have picked a better movie to start off this entire podcast with, even if I tried. However, for those of you who have still somehow not seen Back to the Future, 1, please watch Back to the Future. Okay, thanks. 2, be warned, we are going right past the red tape and deep into spoilers on this one, as we will with every episode on the show. So viewer discretion, or I guess listener discretion, is advised. Anyway, without further ado, you know what? I'm gonna let our guest do the honors.
My name is Max Marriner, and my favorite movie is Back to the Future.
Max Marriner, welcome to the show. Welcome to the first episode of the show. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I'm very excited for this. I've been looking forward to being a part of this.
Happy to have you. For those who don't know, Max and I have been friends and collaborators for a long time. We've done a lot of projects together. We've also talked about Back to the Future a number of times, and I've known that Max's favorite film is Back to the Future, which is why I am having him here. And I think it's appropriate that we start this podcast about movies that are people's favorite movies with a movie that I think is a lot of people's favorite movie. I've talked to a number of people and they're all like, oh yeah, it's probably, I guess it's like, I don't know, Back to the Future or something. It's such a classic movie that people are just like, oh yeah, probably Back to the Future is my favorite. And I just find that very, very interesting.
There is no Back to the Future discourse. There's no hot debate on whether or not the movie is good, actually. No. It's one of the most agreeably good movies perhaps ever made. I'm not saying it's everybody's favorite, but I don't think there's a single person out there who's like, oh, it's just an average movie. It's a very lovable and easy to enjoy film. And I think that's one of the reasons why it endures. One of the many reasons why it endures.
Right. And we'll talk about that for sure in terms of why this movie endures so well. But I'm going to start this conversation with how I start every conversation on this podcast. Talk to me a little bit about your first experience watching this film.
Sure.
And I'm going to kind of give you everything I want. I want the 5 W's and the 1 H. The who, what, where, when, why, and if you're feeling generous, the how of your first experience watching this film.
The first time I ever watched this film was in September 2008. I had just started high school, and I had known Back to the Future very vaguely as just a popular movie from the 80s about time travel. My dad got Back to the Future as a DVD from Netflix because that was the thing you did in 2008 with Netflix. And my whole family, me, my mom, my sister, my dad, and I, we all just watched it. And I remember specifically, I have no problems with this movie. I had just begun, really thinking about film in a much more critical context, which obviously is when you're 14 is pretty limited. But it was a film where it's I can't think of a single thing wrong with this film. Not one.
Were there any moments while watching the film? I mean, it might be hard to recall because this was a number of years ago, but were there any moments while you were first watching the film that you recall as really sticking with you?
Okay, well, on a teenage level, seeing Leah Thompson young for the first time.
Yes. Leah Thompson in Back to the Future is incredibly attractive in that movie.
Yeah, took my breath away. I mean, I specifically remember when I was watching it at 14, I wanted this to be sort of what I wanted high school to be. I was a kid who was a known quantity with a super attractive girlfriend or whatever. It was the dream, right? And I could also go back in time because time travel is cool. And also you can correct mistakes from your past because that's the fun part about time travel on a psychological level.
Yeah, Marty McFly is kind of like the coolest teen ever.
Yeah. But he's also a good guy. Like, there's that scene where he saves his dad from the car. And I don't think he thinks to himself, oh, God, if he dies, then I die. I don't think he operates that well. He's just like, oh, God, my dad's going to get hurt. So he pushes him out of the way, even though he knows the story of how he and his mom met.
One of the strengths of Back to the Future as a franchise is that it is so good at building up story details and callbacks and things like that. And so when you first meet Marty's family, there's that throwaway line, like, oh, how did we meet? Like, how did Marty's parents meet? And what were you doing there, George? Bird watching, like in that moment in the dinner table.
What was it, George? Bird watching?
What, Lorraine? What?
And you don't even think about it when you first watch it.
Oh my God, did they say that? I actually didn't notice that.
Yes, they literally say that.
Watched yesterday.
I feel like Back to the Future's first act is one of the best first acts in any movie I've ever seen because it does such a great job of laying out so many story details and thematic ideas that end up getting played with later on. And so that scene with Marty's parents is when you first meet them is a great example of this because so many details are being laid out for you. And one of those is how they met. You don't notice it because you're just sort of living in Marty's world. You're just sort of following him. You're not actively thinking like, oh, I need to like piece together these details about his story so that way these things make sense when we go back to the 50s. You just sort of absorb it. And then when you get to the scene where George is a peeping Tom in the tree watching the woman from across the street and Marty saves him, like that's that moment. That moment was built up from the very beginning. But what also, to speak to your point about Marty, like the scene is not framed in the sense of Marty's about to interrupt the way his parents first met. It's like Marty's just being Marty. He's just doing what he thinks is right. And I think one of the strengths is that Marty as a character is like just a very good, natural, personable guy. So when all of these story details are playing out, you're like, oh my God, he just interrupted the moment where his parents first met. And as you rewatch the movie over and over, you realize all of these details are being like so well laid for the foundation.
This, of course, brings us to the very first shot of the film, like the famous first shot. Like I remember watching it for the first time and like it only stuck out to me as like a really cool, like well-made, very easygoing shot of like all the cool stuff in Doc Brown's place. But each time I rewatched it, I'm like, okay, this gives us all the information we need in a very direct and like uninterrupted sense. Also, as I watched it just recently, it's like most of this stuff doesn't work. I always sort of revise the scene in my head to be like, oh, it's an awesome Rube Goldberg machine because Doc Brown's a genius and like everything falls into place with like getting the dog food on Einstein's bowl. But no, most of it fails. Most of it's a bad idea. Only a few things actually work, and that encapsulates his Doc Brown as a character so well. And it's weird that I didn't even notice it until now. But it totally like defines the character that we don't actually see for a good like 15 minutes or so. But we understand this guy as soon as we see him. As soon as we see his weird hair, as soon as we see everything that's in his lab, we know Doc Brown so well. And that's thanks to this opening shot. That opening shot does, like, it bench presses the entire narrative like it's a continent.
Speaking of that first shot, there are, like, little details throughout that first shot. Like, I think they talk about the Libyan terrorists. They mention the uprising in Libya, like, during that opening. And then you see, like, newspapers with, like, the date on it and, like,
the Brown mansion burning down.
Yeah, right, exactly. His estate burning down, like, which no one ever talks about that detail, by the way. But it's, like, these stories are, like, they get a little less tight as they go on, but, like, when you first go to the Brown estate in the 50s, it's a crazy like moment where you're like, oh yeah, Doc Brown like had a mansion that burned down. Like no one
because
ever
he had a mansion in 1955, but
right? Exactly.
In 85, and for anybody who's wondering what happened to that mansion, well, you're given an answer before you even consider it.
Exactly.
And then if for anybody who really paid attention to that detail, when Marty arrives at the mansion, you're like, oh, this mansion burns down. Oh shoot! Like you have a little bit of a sense. It doesn't actually like come up in any sense, and it is kind of weird that it's never like just a plot point outside of, oh, it explains this, but it's a cool detail that helps give more texture to Doc's character in a passive, small, but ultimately meaningful sense.
Obviously, you've seen the film a number of times. Do you know how many times you've seen this movie?
Probably 5 or 6. There's some things you just want to have like nice and easy whenever you watch it. Whenever I watch it once every few years, that like remind you why you love movies, why you love filmmaking, and why you love storytelling. That's why I haven't watched it maybe as many times as like my favorite Pixar film or my favorite Marvel film or whatever. Like it's precious. It's a precious little thing.
I mean, there's a really great conversation there about like how often should you watch your favorite movies? You know, like I feel like some people will watch their favorite movies compulsively, like very often. And like I don't know, like there's a part of you that like it kind of ruins the mystique of it if you watch it like too many times. Like I think one of the great things about Back to the Future is it does constantly surprise you because there are so many details.
Director Robert Zemeckis is one of the all-time eccentric technicians in Hollywood history, and although everybody talks about, like the effects of the DeLorean stuff, it's really sort of Back to the Future was where I think he really started to understand like the details and little minutia of storytelling that can really like enhance a more thoughtful audience's experience. And that's where like all those details we've been talking about, all the little things that you don't notice in the first time, but also adds to your rewatch. Like again, I see something new. I see something incredible about this film that I'd never seen before. It's a learning experience every single time. And that's really, really tough for any film to do. It's one thing to be great the first time, but to be better than great every time afterwards, that's a miracle.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this week's episode of My Favorite Movie Is. If you are, I hope you'll check out our introduction to the podcast, as well as our second episode featuring TikTok comedian Katie Siegel, all about the 2005 film adaptation of Pride and Prejudice starring Keira Knightley. Both of these are available now on our show page where new episodes drop every other Monday. And if you're a fan of video podcasts, such as myself, I hope that you'll subscribe to our YouTube channel where video versions of every podcast get posted that following Friday. Don't forget to hit that notification bell to stay updated on exactly when new episodes go up, as well as get some fun bonus content in between episodes. You can follow us at MFMI Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. To learn more about the show and find our full catalog of audio and video episodes, you can visit us at mfmipodcast.com. Thank you so much for listening to My Favorite Movie Is. Now, back to the show. I was wondering if there were any observations that you've sort of had about this movie, whether that be from the first time you saw it or if it came to you in an experience of revisiting it. Are there any like observations you have about the film that you think are important, or an observation that like makes it your favorite? And especially if maybe there's an observation about this movie that like you don't feel like people like talk about, or it's something that's kind of undersaid about a movie that obviously I feel like has been talked about on many podcasts.
What has been said about this movie that hasn't already been said? It's like that phrase that you hear all the time when talking about like Casablanca, The Godfather, whatever. Like that phrase applies to Back to the Future perhaps more so than any other film, like made in the last 30, 40 years. However, I feel like people talk about Back to the Future in very simplistic terms, not entirely unfounded. The movie is not exactly a super artistic film. It's almost workmanlike in how it's designed. But the reason why it's my favorite, the thing I noticed when I was watching this film, it is specifically about spitting in the face of destiny and fate and predestination. It is a story about somebody deciding to make his history better and not being the person everybody thinks it is. Like I always think of that incredibly like unsubtle confrontation between Marty and Mr. Strickland. He's just like, no McFly has ever made any impact in the history of Hill Valley. And Marty goes, well, history's about to change.
No McFly ever amounted to anything in the history of Hill Valley.
Yeah, well, history is going to change.
I will say that's one of the best moments of the first act. Those lines that are so simple and feel so like, obviously they're very cheesy, like no McFly has ever made anything in the history of Hill Valley. They're fun, but they encapsulate the theme so well. And it's another reason, talking about the first act, it is one of the many moments of the first act that do such a great job of establishing like what the movie is about. What are the themes and ideas of the movie?
Up until that moment, I consider that scene like, it's like a fun, silly, like cheesy thing. It's like, oh, it's foreshadowing because history is going to change because that's how the movie works. But no, it's really more so a kid, our main character, going, I am not who you think I am, and I am going to make things better. And as somebody who values autonomy, who values the freedom to do what we think is right and what we think is good for ourselves, I think that's really good. Not assigning ourselves to some story that we didn't write, you know? And I think that's why the movie speaks to me on such a profound level. That's why it's my favorite movie. Watching it now, I realize the entire subplot with the entire side story with Doc Brown and Marty trying to tell him what happens to him is absolutely a reinforcement of that theme. It never occurred to me until now. I was like, why did Doc go back on his character? Why did he do that? It's because of Marty. Marty is the agent of chaos. He is the enemy of fate and destiny. He is, ironically, even though like in a meta sense, he's trying to tell the story of his parents meeting for the first time, it fails. He fails in trying to arrange destiny. It only happens because the people that he tries to confront, the people that he tries to get together, they have to act on their own will. Not only that, but like Doc Brown's story is about consistently, no, I don't want to know what happens to me.
I warned you about this, kid! The consequences could be disastrous!
And you know what? On a surface level, I'm like, I get that. I understand that. But then, as he gives Marty that letter that he taped back together, telling him, "Oh God, I'm going to be you're going to be gunned down by terrorists. You should do something about that. Like on this night at this time specifically." He decides, no, it's not worth not knowing my destiny to be gunned down by terrorists when I create the thing I spend the next 30 years making. No, life is precious and important, and Marty wants to preserve that. And I think that's strong, that's powerful, that's meaningful in a sense that not a lot of people talk about with this film. It is about spitting in the face of everything about not only like the stories of the chosen ones of it is your destiny. Like it is also about just not being what we think we have to be. Being our own thing, blazing our own trails. And I think that's meaningful and powerful.
The ideas of fate and destiny that you were talking about earlier. When you said that, I was like, but wait, like, isn't the whole point of the movie that, like, Marty is trying to, like, retain destiny or, like, retain the destiny and fate? But you bring up this great point in which he does fail. Like, Marty doesn't really
every time
do
he tries
anything.
He messes up.
Yeah, Marty
He
doesn't
fails.
really do anything. George does it entirely on his own. I mean, I don't know entirely, but most of it on entirely his own will. He punches Biff, gets the girl, they meet, blah blah blah. I mean, there's that great moment obviously with Doc Brown with the bulletproof vest. The Libyan terrorists come for him, they shoot him, and it's the bulletproof vest, and Marty goes like, but what about like destiny, or what about the space-time continuum? And he goes like, what the hell? I figured, what the hell? And that's such a, oh man, great scene.
What would following destiny amount to? Doc still dies. The night he finally does time travel, solves it after 30 years, he dies that night. He gets gunned down by terrorists. Again, that's like the one part of the movie that just really, really doesn't age well. I don't know. The whole Libyan terrorist thing, really weird. I don't get it. I remember watching the movie for the first time and seeing Doc Brown get gunned down. I was shocked. I knew about Doc Brown. I knew about Marty. I did not know that part. And it's an amazing part. One of the real triumphs of this movie, and why I don't try to revisit it that often, is because it is suspenseful. The conflict never stops. I used to think that maybe this film has a double climax, but no, its climax is just like 4 scenes long.
The climax with Doc at the clock tower is so good. God, you think about all the things that happened during that scene. Like, Marty gets back, he goes into the DeLorean. The DeLorean doesn't start. Marty has to like bang his head on the steering wheel to get the DeLorean to start. That's one. Then Doc realizes that the cord won't go in because the tree is like blocking the cord down from like being fully expendable. Even before that, he has to get across the gargoyles on the clock tower. Then he has to pull it. He zip lines down. I mean, I think one of the reasons that it is such a great climax and so suspenseful is because it doesn't happen until literally the very second. Doc zip lines down, and it barely even plugs in. He barely even gets the plug in before the lightning strikes and like goes through him and gets to the DeLorean. It is split second victory, which I mean is very appropriate given that it's, all about time. And it's all about, timing it exactly to the point. But like also in terms of like conflict, when you talk about that scene after George punches Biff, Marty takes out the picture and it's still fading. And he realizes, like, oh, God, the band. Like, the band has to play so that they can dance, so that they can kiss. So then he has to play for the band. And then after that, exactly, that iconic moment with the hand, moment after moment after moment, there is so much conflict. And that is what keeps you on your toes.
The way this film is structured, not being artistic is not a bad thing at all. It's designed to be very much a crowd pleaser, and it's not subtle in its delivery. Like each line is quotable because it's delivered with such gravitas. Like, save the clock tower, or like, I like that Goldie Wilson, like that kind of stuff. These are lines that are so like given with such like 110% effort and stuff. And usually, yeah, 80s cheesiness, but it's just sincerity.
I mean, if you're talking about a great effort, I feel like every line that comes out of Christopher Lloyd's mouth in this movie is said with like the most conviction. Like, this guy has fully registered the stakes of the situation. I feel like his go-to face is like,
it's about like, it's a crowd pleaser that wears its heart on its sleeve. I think it's maybe the secret formula to why certain blockbusters take off and resonate. It's not just that they're made to please like the biggest possible crowd. It's that you can tell this, and you can see the sincerity through how the lines are written and how through the characters act. On the note of you mentioned with Christopher Lloyd, I noticed this time this movie very much kind of featured as a blueprint for what is normally called the live-action cartoon. Think of movies like Dick Tracy and, of course, Speed Racer, The Adventures of Rocky and Bullwinkle, movies that definitely borrow from the animation aesthetic. I think of, what is his name? Old Man Peabody shooting off his mailbox, like it's just going the whole thing off, or like the out-of-time license plate spinning in the center of the frame and then falling. That stuff is so cartoony and so direct and so like emotionally like filled. It's like, it's not just, oh no, there's a bullet in there. No, the whole mailbox is coming off, baby. That conveys a sense of emotional honesty that is usually only saved for cartoons because it's considered childish. And Back to the Future is not childish at all. It's just honest. It's just sincere. And it doesn't really have any time to be like, it doesn't have time to be like weird and underhanded. It's like, no, we got to do this, that, and the other thing. And Christopher Lloyd is basically a cartoon character in this film. Like, his giant wide eyes. It's no wonder this movie was adapted into an animated series.
It's also no surprise that Christopher Lloyd would end up playing an actual like cartoon character in Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is by also another film by Robert Zemeckis.
Mm-hmm. Also one of my favorite films.
Yeah, that's another classic. Yeah, there are a lot of moments now that you mention it that are like that. Biff is basically a cartoon villain. I mean, he's basically a skinnier version of Pete, the dog from Mickey Mouse. You know, he even sounds like,
oh, no, not even Pete's like this stupid. Like,
that's true. In the very opening of the film, when Marty plays his guitar with the speaker system and completely blows it out to the point where the speaker just literally rips open.
The cinematography is so forward. It's not about subtlety. It's never about subtlety. It's like, this is what's happening. We're going to make it look nice, but this is what is happening. Please pay attention to that.
Man, think about that punch. Think about George McFly's when he's punching Biff. It's not like a simple thing. He goes from behind, wallops him in the face, and then Biff like spins around and goes like that. Like
when like that weird redhead like takes Lorraine.
Mind if I butt in, McFly?
The redhead is laughing maniacally like a cartoon supervillain.
Absolutely,
there's like that one part where we're flying over all the kids dancing to Johnny Be Good, and there's that one guy who's just on the ground like dancing and snapping his fingers at the other girl dancing, which is the weirdest thing I have maybe ever seen in any dance scene. We consider that stuff childish and cheesy because it's not really interested in beating around the bush. It's like, this is what's happening. These are the emotions that are on display. These are the emotions that we want to convey to you. And we pick it up. We pick it up because the film earns it. It earns that trust from the audience because like it follows through on everything it sets up in that first act. You know what's weird? I noticed this film is kind of like almost a period piece of its own time.
I was literally just about to say, one of the you're talking about all the reason it endures, talking about it being a cartoon. You know, everyone likes to call Back to the Future like one of the most 80s movies of all time. Your point just now about like how it knows exactly what it is and there's like no subtlety about it. Like, to me, that is part of why it's so enduring, because all of that sincerity is being channeled into being just like 100% an 80s movie. And like, this is a movie that takes place in the 80s. It's about a kid who grows up in the 80s, which for a lot of movies, doesn't go well. Like, I feel like there are so many movies that came out from the 80s or the 70s or even the 90s, especially for kids of my generation, where we look back on them and we're like, oh my God, that's so dated. Like, oh my God, those references make no sense, like all that stuff. But for Back to the Future, it is literally a movie about time. The movie is about like traveling through time. So like, you need to make it about the 80s, because without making something so strictly in the 80s, you're not going to get the juxtaposition of it taking place in the 50s.
Yeah, the contrast needs to be as defined as possible, and they nail it. Like, I have never seen anyone else in any 80s media wear the life jacket thing that Marty wears. I've never seen that in any other character, but I believe it because it makes sense for like, oh yeah, the 80s had weird fashion. Like, watching this movie now, it is like, no, this is a movie that takes place in 1985 and he goes back to 1955, and it's never like, oh, this movie feels so of its own time. It really doesn't, and that's, again, a miracle. That's the difference. That's the thing that makes Back to the Future like work, is that it was not really embarrassed or ashamed of the era from which it came. It's like, we're weird, yeah, but like, we stick out and we still have all the same elements of humanity that like every other decade has, including the 50s. For a movie about time travel, this movie is surprisingly timeless.
Max, we're coming to the end of the conversation here, but before you go, I want to do the MFMI lightning round with you, which is a series of questions where I'm going to ask you about your favorite things from this movie. Do your best to answer as impulsively as possible. Don't give it too much thought. I just want your raw thoughts and your raw favorites from this movie. Okay, here we go. Favorite scene.
Opening scene. Walking in and like guitar and everything. Like, yes, opening scene.
Favorite character.
Marty
McFly.
One of the best protagonists of his time.
Favorite location or set.
The diner is like, it's just a lot of really great moments in there. Like, you know, Goldie Wilson, like Idea of Running for Mayor, or like, you know, the confrontation, or give me a milk, chocolate, like that kind of thing.
Favorite song featured in the film.
Though My Heart goes out to Earth Angel, Back in Time slams. It doesn't just slap, it slams.
It slams. If you could pair Back to the Future with one additional film, not counting the sequels, for a double header, what would you say?
I would pair up Back to the Future with the original Spider-Man, because they exude a lot of the same qualities and a lot of the same emotional sincerity. They are obvious, they are unsubtle, so that's what I would pair those. Back to the Future and the original Spider-Man.
Very interesting. Sam Raimi's like, Spider-Man from...
Yeah, like I do mean Spider-Man, the original, the very first one. The original Spider-Man is absolutely a film that embodies a lot of the same things as Back to the Future.
If Back to the Future is your number one favorite film, what is the film that comes up right beneath it?
The Social Network. Like, I have like a top 5 in The Social Network, The Incredibles, Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Another Zemeckis classic.
I know, yeah. See, this is why I will never not give Zemeckis a chance. Again, just like with Back to the Future, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, it is a technician's fever dream. Hopefully somebody on this show talks about it.
I mean, that's another great doubleheader, I feel. Back to the Future and Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
You know, maybe that would be a better answer.
Yeah, but your answer
or Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Yeah, but your original answer is more interesting. It's more unique. I don't think people would think about that. Last one. Favorite response you've gotten from somebody when you tell them that this is your favorite?
Either it's my favorite too, or yeah, no, that makes sense. Like, nobody has ever disagreed or been like, that doesn't really like fit, you know? And I've actually gotten more than one person going, yeah, it's my favorite film too, because it's just an easy film it's such an easy film to love. I don't have to put any effort into loving, into adoring this piece of cinema. I don't have to put any effort. It is all there, right there. It is so easy. It like welcomes me into that emotion, into that feeling. And that's not something that most pieces of art can claim.
Max Marriner, thank you so much for being on the show. It was great to have you here.
It was a pleasure, Larry.
It was great to talk about Back to the Future. Where can people find you and your work?
People can find me on YouTube just as Max Marriner. And people can also find me on Twitter, Mr. MR Max Marriner. Very simple stuff.
And they can also find you on Game Rant, yes?
That's right. You can find me on Game Rant.
Read Max's articles on Game Rant. Any final thoughts? Any final words, Max?
I look forward to seeing the episodes to come from this. It's gonna be fun, Larry. I think this is exactly the kind of show that you would that works for you.
And just like that, you have made it to the end of our first episode. Thank you so much for listening, and thanks especially to Max Marriner for being such a great first guest to have on the show and for bringing his unique and passionate perspective on all things Back to the Future. We actually posted a second episode featuring Katie Siegel, who's a TikTok comedian, actress, podcaster, just extraordinary multi-hyphenate, on 2005's Pride and Prejudice starring Keira Knightley. It's a super fun conversation, very different from this one in all the best ways, and you can check that out as well as the introduction to our podcast as a whole, if you're looking for more information, on our show page. You should follow us there. That way you'll be notified whenever a new episode goes up every other Monday. And be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube so that way you can check out the video version of that podcast, which will go up the following Friday. You can also be notified when new episodes go up by following us on our social media pages at MFMI Podcast on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. For more information on our show, as well as a full catalog of audio and video episodes, you can go to MFMIpodcast.com. Lastly, for sponsorship or other business inquiries, if you have a question about the show or if you just want to say hi, you can contact us at our email, hello@mfmipodcast.com. Until next time, thanks for listening. My Favorite Movie is a Larry Freed Presents production. It is executive produced, created, hosted, and directed by me, Larry Freed, and it is also produced by me alongside Brian Novak. Our assistant director is Stephen Reyes, and our editors are myself, as well as Clayton and Kimberly Allen. Our graphic designer is Monica Sarmiento, our motion graphics designer is Elton Greenfield, and our theme song, Now and Then, as well as any other music featured on the show, is composed and performed by Matt Gorduke. For this episode, our camera operator was Kevin Lynn, our sound recordist was Dominic Mistretta, and our production assistant was Ben Seltzer. A huge thank you to all of these incredibly talented and wonderful individuals without whom this show just would not be possible. You can check out their social handles and websites in the show notes. My name is Larry Freed, and this has been My Favorite Movie Is.